Since the Act of Union in 1801 that formally abolished the autonomous Kingdom of Ireland, the Irish people continued to chafe under direct rule from London. The Catholic Irish majority of the island existed in a state of almost complete religious, cultural, and economic suppression at the mercy of their English and Anglo-Irish overlords. Many people, fed up with this state of affairs, took to political action to achieve at least some degree of parity within the empire. In 1829, the Catholic population was wholly emancipated and finally allowed political rights, thanks partially to the actions of Daniel O'Connell, the head of the first Irish mass political movement. This emancipation concluded a half-century-long series of laws being repealed that granted Catholics some crazy rights like being allowed to hold political office and being legally allowed to educate their children as Catholics. However, the Irish continued to remain second-class citizens. Others elected to take a more violent approach, from uprisings to terrorism to, invading fucking Canada a few times. Yes, that actually happened. But none of these attempts would succeed, and Ireland remained subjugated. O'Connell, for all his skill and influence, did not succeed in his ultimate goal of repealing the Act of Union and regaining legislative independence, something that he regarded as his greatest failure. And things would get worse before they got better. In the following decades, a cascading series of problems, including overpopulation, lack of crop specialization, and a bunch of British laws that screwed over Catholic tenant farmers, meant that when the potato blight struck the island in 1845, a horrific famine occurred that saw Ireland's population drop by upwards of 25% in 10 years. The British government completely failed to help the situation and actively made it worse by forcing continued food exports during its worst years. This became known to history as the Great Hunger, and it permanently shifted the demographics of the island, the effects of which are felt to this day. Following this great catastrophe, the remnants of the more radical reform faction of O'Connell's movement, having been largely destroyed after a failed uprising in 1848, established the Irish Republican Brotherhood in 1858. It was a clandestine revolutionary republican organization that sought to resist British rule in Ireland. They really came into their own in the early 1900s, but until then they would be a very minor force on the island and were nearly destroyed by multiple crackdowns and failed uprisings. The final big piece of context needed to set the scene is Charles Stewart Parnell. He was among the first bigwig politicians to seriously begin the campaign towards home rule in Ireland. He was the leader of the Home Rule League beginning in 1880, which would transform into the Titanic Irish Parliamentary Party 2 years later. This party was unique in that it was an all-Irish party with significant backing from the Catholic population while still enjoying a surprising amount of support from Protestants, with Parnell himself being one. Utilizing broad popular support and the IPP's position as one of the largest parties in Westminster, Parnell played kingmaker and backed Liberal Party proposals for home rule in 1886. However, the Tories, pro-unionist Liberals, and Irish Unionists managed to sink it, and the Liberals lost the subsequent election. Despite this, Parnell pushed on, fighting through increasingly organized Unionist Protestant resistance, but he would fall short, mostly because it was revealed that he was an adulterer and had a years-long affair with a married woman, and his name was promptly dragged through the fucking mud. He died of pneumonia in 1891, leaving the reins of the IPP, which had now split into like 5 different factions and parties, to one John Redmond. Home rule would become the defining issue of nearly 30 years of British politics, and the fall of Parnell would inadvertently set the country on the unstoppable march to freedom. It is against this backdrop that on October 16th of 1890, in a small cottage on a stretch of land called Woodfield, roughly between Rosscarbery and Clonakilty in County Cork, that one of the men who would come to define the nation and her path to liberty would be born. His name was Michael Collins, the final child of 8 born to Michael John Collins and Mary Ann O'Brien. From the get-go, little Michael would have his life path basically set in stone for him. Big Michael was a member of the IRB, making sure to instill a fierce sense of nationalism in little Michael before promptly dropping dead when he was 6. His mother, meanwhile, was far younger than his father and is described as a charming, energetic, and very intelligent woman. As such, little Michael received a fairly high-quality early life education steeped in Irish nationalism. The family wasn't rich, but they weren't poor either, and they had more than enough to get by for the most part. As he aged, he would attend a local school and would also apprentice with a local blacksmith, in between sessions of working on the family farm. As a kid, Collins is described as charming, athletic, and a very smart student, but also an absolute dipshit who had a habit of fucking around. As such, his mother made the determination that if he stayed in Woodfield, his potential would be wasted. So he was essentially told to go do something productive and went to Clonakilty to continue his education at the age of 13. It is in his relatively free teenage years that the nickname, the Big Fella, began to pop up. It was a moniker denoting his brash, independent, and larger-than-life personality, meshing with his physical appearance as a man 6 foot tall and built like a brick shithouse. He was charismatic as hell, could drink you under the table, and could clock a bitch if need be, but still retained an intelligent air to him. He could make friends just as easily as he could make enemies, flew in every Irish-related social circle and sports club you can imagine, and still managed to do good at the serious stuff like school and work. His nationalistic fervor would deepen considerably as he met more people and learned more about his people's history. He spent a year and a half in Clonakilty, working at his sister's husband's newspaper office for the duration. He would take the exam required to work at a post office, pass, and promptly move to London in 1906, where he was given a job at the Post Office Savings Bank in West Kensington. During his time in London, he was definitely a party boy, and mostly stuck to his fellow Irishmen, playing in and becoming treasurer of his local Gaelic Athletic Association. After some time working for the post office, he jumped around to a few other jobs, primarily in the field of finance, and more specifically at a stockbroker's joint, developing considerable skill in the field. He's also noted as being very adept at organization, and often took leading roles as an organizer in his jobs. His nationalism also became increasingly overt in his writings and associations, and he became notably anti-clerical, developing opposition to the entrenched Catholic social order that existed in Ireland. This led him to an interesting encounter with a relatively new Irish political organization called Sinn Féin. Okay. Sinn Féin was a nationalist political party founded in 1907 as a merger of a few other nationalist political organizations that had popped up. The leading figure was one Arthur Griffith, and it elected to follow a policy based on that of Hungary of all places, attempting to achieve autonomy through winning seats in parliament and then boycotting to fuck with governmental functions. The party saw limited success early on, but after 1910 fell to the wayside due to lack of membership and funding. This will become relevant a little later, but what's interesting is Sinn Féin's relationship with the Irish Republican Brotherhood. By 1905, the IRB was basically a non-entity run by old-timers who didn't really give a shit. This was until the American Irish Republican organization, Clan na Gael, airdropped one Tom Clark to go revitalize and reorganize the dying Brotherhood. One of the nationalist groups that was folded into Sinn Féin were called the Dungannon Clubs, founded by Balmer Hobson, Dennis McCullough, and Sean MacDiarmada, who had a cheeky run-in with Clark and promptly elected to help him out. The IRB was purged and rebuilt, rebuilding its roster with young, fiery, and patriotic Republican Irishmen who would be willing to start fucking people up. Sinn Féin was not openly aligned with the IRB, but many members of Sinn Féin were either members of or were influenced by the IRB. This would gradually shift the party away from its roots and more towards nationalist republicanism. While this was all happening, the Irish Parliamentary Party was getting shit done. After the split, a second Home Rule Bill was put to vote in 1893, which passed the House of Commons but was smited by the overwhelmingly Tory-controlled House of Lords. Despite this setback, the party was able to reunify after some political maneuvering and went on a tear of shoving through legislation using their massive number of seats in the House. Finally, in 1910, the opportunity presented itself. A constitutional crisis at the tail end of 1909 was caused by the Conservative House of Lords shutting down the Liberal Party budget, something that they were technically not allowed to do. This saw the Liberal British government of H.H. Asquith, take a guess what the H.H. stands for. That's right, Herbert Hoover, nearly collapsed and triggered not one, but 2 elections in 1910 in an attempt to secure their mandate. First past the post is a dog shit system, and the Liberal Party lost both popular votes, but still won by exactly 1 seat. As such, the IPP became the kingmakers, agreeing to give the Liberals their majority in exchange for Home Rule. The Liberal Party immediately pushed through a law called the Parliament Act of 1911 that permanently crushed the power of the House of Lords, which coincidentally meant that the final major opposition to Irish Home Rule had been neutered. Holding up his end of the bargain, Asquith introduced the Third Home Rule Bill on April 11th of 1912. This spooked the Unionists in Ireland quite considerably. They were deathly afraid that Home Rule would strip them of the privileges they still had. Despite centuries of plantation, Catholic native Irish were still a supermajority, and the Protestants would simply be outvoted in the event of an independent legislature. Furthermore, the majority of Irish Protestants were middle and upper class, many of them being urban industrial workers and business owners, especially in Belfast, which by this point was the most economically powerful city on the island. They benefited greatly by being a part of the United Kingdom and had many economic ties with the other island and the vast British Empire. Home Rule would complicate matters, and if it eventually led to total independence, there was a real chance that their economic prosperity would disappear. There was a very real and admittedly very valid fear that the Protestants would get shit-canned, and as such they began to mobilize to resist. The vast majority of the Irish Protestant population was located in the province of Ulster, the northern one, and this was the region that saw extreme unionist resistance to any idea of home rule. And if home rule couldn't be avoided, then a partition of the island into a unionist north and a nationalist south was the other preferable option. An idea which nobody was really happy with and would almost guarantee a century of problems. That's called foreshadowing. Notable figures in the Unionist movement, with the backing of the Orange Order, who are a whole nother can of vile fucking worms that I won't get into, formed a militia to mobilize this resistance, the Ulster Volunteer Force. They were formed in early 1912 and formalized in January of 1913, by at that point numbering 100,000 men. Threatening armed rebellion against the British government if they imposed home rule on Ulster, the time known as the Home Rule Crisis had begun. Now, the nationalists in the IPP and elsewhere weren't about to back down to unionist saber-rattling. Our protagonists in the IRB saw the formation of the UVF as a perfect excuse to engineer the creation of a nationalist counter-militia, dubbed the Irish Volunteers in 1913. The IRB were the de facto leaders of the Irish Volunteers, and they had near total control over their operations, but they did their best to conceal their involvement by encouraging recruitment from basically every major political and cultural organization in Ireland, including the IPP and Sinn Féin. Redmond himself was a pretty big supporter of the Volunteers and did everything in his power to attain some control over the group to further his aims. The Volunteers were also later reinforced by the Irish Women's Council, an initially independent all-female Irish paramilitary founded in April of the next year by a number of notable women in the independence movement. For our purposes, the one that matters is Countess Constance Markievicz. The forces of Irish nationalism would come to number nearly 200,000 at their peak before the start of World War I, and their emergence caused the suits in London to start properly panicking. The UVF and IVF weren't openly fighting yet, and they were honestly trying pretty hard to avoid each other wherever possible, but all it would take is one fuck-up, one bloody street clash to cause Ireland to descend into complete anarchy. Furthermore, attempts by British authorities to disarm and rein in these groups were very unsuccessful, even resulting in a few small skirmishes with both. And the absolute funniest part is that the Germans were supplying guns and ammunition to both of them. They were literally fighting a proxy war with themselves. So you had the Irish Volunteers and the UVF fighting the British government, and they were fighting each other, all while the nationalist IPP was backing the British government against the Protestant Unionists, and the Germans are playing every fucking side at once so they cannot possibly lose. And we haven't even fucking talked about the Irish Citizens Army yet. Sorry, you thought this was a Michael Collins video? Yeah, fucking right. The ICA was the paramilitary wing of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, founded by James Connolly during the Dublin lockout of 1913 to defend the striking workers from reprisals. Connolly was a committed Marxist and believed that the ICA would be a perfect starting point for the establishment of an Irish socialist republic. The organization suffered from the popularity of the Volunteers as they attracted potential recruits away from the ICA, and as a result, Connolly was kind of forced by circumstance to stay in their good graces and help them out as an ally. Oh, yeah, I hope you're good at remembering names and acronyms. This is Irish history, you pleb. We've only just begun with the name dumps. During this whole shit show, Michael Collins was busy making himself somebody. As I said, 7 paragraphs ago now, Collins had a run-in with Sinn Féin in early 1909, where he read a paper at a conference that denounced the role of the Catholic Church in Irish society. This, along with his other interactions with groups like the Gaelic Athletic Association, put him on the IRB's radar. For young and ambitious Collins, the idea of joining the super epic secret society dedicated to liberating Ireland was a tantalizing one, so he joined up and was sworn in November of 1909. In his time between playing sports, working, and doing secret society chicanery, he was also taking classes at King's College to take the civil service exam for a potential career in public sector finance. Collins was many things, but lazy he was absolutely not. He also continued down his nationalist rabbit hole, culminating with him joining the Volunteers on April 25th of 1914. In the meantime, Redmond got his wish, and the 1914 Government of Ireland Act was pushed through by Asquith, bypassing the House of Lords using the powers given by the 1911 Act. However, now came actually enforcing it, which would inevitably lead to bloodshed. If only there was a massive international incident that would spiral into an apocalyptic war to take everyone's minds off the whole Civil War thing. Well, that's convenient. The kinda mediocre kerfuffle gave Britain some breathing room on the Ireland question. The outbreak led to an indefinite pause on home rule for the duration of the conflict, which was shockingly well received by most. War fever absolutely swept the island like it did everywhere else. In the process, the UVF offered its services in the name of King and Country, forming several regular army units that were shipped to various theaters. They displayed courage and heroism at battles like the Somme, but it's still World War I, so they were slaughtered by the thousands and were basically a non-issue for the nationalists until 1920. For the Irish volunteers, meanwhile, the war brought a split. Redmond was pro-British, i.e. he advocated for supporting the war on the grounds of putting Ireland in a stronger bargaining position. Those that followed him also believed in helping achieve freedom for the other small nations of Europe, as was ostensibly the British stance on the war. As such, the Redmond faction formed the National Volunteers, taking the vast majority of the volunteers with them. Ironically, the units they formed fought side by side with their Protestant Unionist counterparts, and the two actually worked very well together. The remaining volunteers, about 14,000 of them, elected to stay their own course, now without the moderates. The organization was subsequently reformed and adopted a cute little constitution. A central council was also established, staffed mostly by IRB men, and they started radicalizing the volunteers towards the idea of an uprising. In 1915, the IRB formed a military council as a perceived prelude to military action. It consisted of Pearse, Plunkett, Clark, MacDiarmada, and Éamon Ceannt. In January of 1916, James Connolly was brought onto the council along with the ICA. Gradually, people began warming up to the idea of violent uprising. This time seemed perfect for it, after all. The British were nice and distracted in Europe. A revolt could be rather successful if pulled off correctly. Furthermore, many believed that they had a sort of duty to the Irish nation to at least fight for their freedom, whether they failed or not. The plan was a broad uprising across the island while seizing control over major institutions in Dublin and essentially bargaining with the British using the island as leverage. The date of the rising was set for April 23rd, 1916, Easter Sunday. Collins returned to Ireland with the express intention of joining this planned uprising, landing in Dublin on January 15th of 1916. He spent the first little bit of the year as financial advisor to the Plunkett family while working as an accountant to supplement his income. He also began worming his way to the center of IRB affairs, becoming a trusted and respected member of the organization and also proving capable in the field of smuggling. However, even before the uprising was planned to start, things started going to shit. London had intercepted communications between the IRB and the Germans, resulting in a shipment of weapons being seized off the coast of County Kerry on Good Friday, the 21st, and their liaison with the Germans, Roger Casement, being arrested. Then, one of the moderate members of the volunteers, Éireann MacNeill, who had explicitly not been informed of the uprising's date, learned of the utterly suicidal nature of what they were about to do and issued an order countermanding orders for an uprising, resulting in the rising being delayed to the 24th, and there being a great deal of confusion with relatively low turnout. The IRB leaders, fully aware that their revolt would now be basically hopeless, decided to die standing anyway, and thus, on the morning of the 24th, the rebels mustered. Collins was made Plunkett's aide, and as such, was one of the first in the door when the rebels marched on the General Post Office in the heart of Dublin. The building was basically a big fuck-off concrete blockhouse that was easy to defend and offered a commanding position over central Dublin. Many other locations were simultaneously attacked and taken with basically no casualties. On the steps of the GPO, Plunkett read the drafted proclamation of the Republic signed by 7 of the uprising's major leaders. The rebels numbered somewhere in the area of 1,200 men and women, compared to the immediately available 6,000 British troops and constabulary members in the region. However, in typical World War I British fashion, they were caught completely flat-fucking-footed, getting their asses beat on the first day of the rising. The rebels could not, however, press the advantage, instead opting to turtle up in their strongholds, which they spent the day and night of the 24th fortifying. This left them without the Dublin ports or rail stations, allowing the Brits to later pour in reinforcements. Collins immediately proved himself extremely talented. He did little actual fighting, but he ran around the GPO performing numerous organizational tasks that are crucial to any war effort. He showed himself to be unbelievably composed under the pressure, a trait which some definitely lacked. However, say it with me fellas, individual heroism is rarely enough to turn the tides of history. The early morning of Tuesday the 25th saw the British reinforced and organized. Constance Markievicz and the ICA were driven off of St. Stephen's Green and forced back into the Royal College of Surgeons. In the north of the city, the British brought in artillery and shelled another few positions into retreat. This allowed the guns to be repositioned in more central locations, opening up the strong points to relentless shelling, killing many and breaking the will of many more. The rebels proved successful in several hit-and-run attacks on the now rapidly multiplying British troops, but it was very quickly becoming clear that things were going to hell fast. The British had the overwhelming advantage of being the British fucking Empire, most powerful empire to ever exist, and the longer the rising went, the more bodies and ammunition they could funnel into the increasingly outnumbered rebels. It was not a matter of of if they would win, it was a matter of how long it would take. The first rebel position to surrender would be the men under Sean Houston at the Mendicity Institution on Wednesday afternoon, capitulating after 2 days encircled by an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. However, none of this British success came free, and they took sizable casualties attempting to dislodge rebels from buildings. One encounter of note came at Mount Street Bridge, where 17 volunteers caught a British unit in a crossfire, killing 28 and wounding 188 more. This was largely because the British commander was a dumbass of mythical proportions, basically sending his men to die unsupported. On the other end of town, brutal room-to-room fighting over the South Dublin Union complex ended basically in a draw, while the British attempted unsuccessfully to advance towards forecourts, being cut to pieces by entrenched Irish troops. Pissed by their lack of progress, British forces started committing war crimes because Brits are gonna Brit, killing dozens of innocent civilians. Thousands more would be caught in the crossfire as Dublin was basically destroyed. By Friday, the British brought their guns to bear on the GPO. The gunboat Helga had set the place on fire, and the rebels within tunneled to a nearby building to escape. Collins would lead a small attempt to break out, but this proved unsuccessful, and after the death of his childhood best friend, he was on the verge of a mental break of his own. In the early hours of Saturday the 29th, Collins and his men surrendered. Later that day, to prevent more loss of life, Pierce called a ceasefire, ordering an unconditional surrender of all remaining rebel holdouts. The Easter Rising had failed. The volunteers were marched up O'Connell Street and into various places for internment. The Dublin crowd didn't see them as attempted liberators, many dismayed and angry at the loss of life and destruction in the city. The British authorities declared total victory, promptly blamed Sinn Féin despite them having literally jack all to do with the uprising, and began doling out the punishments. John Maxwell was made the military governor of Ireland following the surrender with the express purpose of restoring order. Over the following days, 3,500 people would be arrested and martial law was declared. However, he would fuck up catastrophically in his handling of the arrested. First, hundreds of totally innocent people were booked under this martial law for basically no reason, something which did not stoke pro-British sentiment. Second, he did basically nothing to punish British troops that had massacred civilians during the Rising, which also pissed a lot of people off. But where he screwed up most was in his handling of the Rising's leadership. He ordered their trials to be behind closed doors, with the defendants banned from legal counsel or a jury of peers, in effect turning them into rubber stamps. The courts were also stacked with people who had fought in the Rising who were abso-fucking-lutely not impartial. This went directly against British military legal code and was therefore entirely illegal, but Maxwell went ahead with it anyway. Then he started handing out death sentences. 90 of the rebels would be sentenced to death by firing squad, and 15 would be confirmed by Maxwell. The intent was a show of force to dissuade further revolutionary actions. The actual result was the exact opposite. Much of the Rising's leadership was in Kilmainham Gaol for the duration of the trials and later executions. When the prisoners' time came, they were taken to this courtyard, put up against this wall, and shot. The first was Patrick Pearse, co-founder of the Irish Volunteers. He served as Commander-in-Chief of Irish Forces and was shot early in the morning on May 3rd at the age of 36. He was followed by Thomas MacDonagh, commander of troops at the Biscuit Factory during the Rising. He was shot on the 3rd at the age of 38. Tom Clark followed, executed on the 3rd at the age of 58, leaving behind his wife, the future Lord Mayor of Dublin Kathleen Clark, and 3 children. Joseph Plunkett came next. He was one of the key planners of the Easter Rising. While in Kilmainham, his girlfriend Grace learned of his pending execution the evening before it took place, purchasing a ring and convincing the prison chaplain to marry them beforehand. The evening of the 3rd, they were wed in the prison chapel, afterwards being permitted to spend exactly 10 minutes together, time they mostly spent in silence. Immediately afterwards, Plunkett was taken to the courtyard at around 3 a.m. on the 4th of May and shot. He was 28 years old. After Plunkett came William Pearse, Patrick's younger brother. He was executed on the 4th at the age of 34. Edward Dáil, who led the forces at Four Courts during the Rising, came next, executed on the 4th at the age of just 25. He was the youngest executed for participation in the Rising. Soon after Dáil came Michael O'Hanrahan. He was a Sinn Féiner and was Tom MacDonagh's second-in-command at the Biscuit Factory. He was the last executed on the 4th at the age of 39. John MacBride was the only man executed on the 5th. He stands out amongst the uprising leadership in that he had first-hand military experience, joining the Boers in South Africa to fight against the British in 1899. He was not a member of the Volunteers, but when the Rising broke out, he hightailed it to the Biscuit Factory where he offered to help out. He was shot on the 5th at the age of 47. He was defiant to British authority to the end, refusing to be blindfolded for his execution. Éamon Ceannt, Michael Malins, Sean Houston, and Con Colbert were all executed one after the other on May 8th. Ceannt was a member of the IRB's military council and a key planner of the Rising, and was shot at the age of 34. Malin was James Connolly's second-in-command in the ICA, fighting alongside Constance Markievicz Markievicz at St. Stephen's Green and the College of Surgeons. He was 41 and left behind 4 children and his wife pregnant with their 5th. Houston led the occupation of the Mendicity Institute and was only 25 at the time of his execution. Lastly, Colbert was Tom Clark's bodyguard. He was also a deeply religious man, holding no fear of death, merely asking that a fellow prisoner say a Hail Mary for him after they heard the gunshots. He was last that day, and he was only 27. James Connolly, the ICA leader, had a particularly controversial execution. He was appointed commandant of the Dublin forces and led the group that occupied the GPO. During the rising, he was mortally wounded. Due to the lack of proper medical attention, he was basically guaranteed to die regardless. Completely unable to stand due to a gangrenous foot and requiring daily morphine injections to even sleep, he was put on trial in a stretcher, but despite his wounds, he was sentenced to death anyway. He was carried to the courtyard, tied to a chair, blindfolded, and shot on May 12th at the age of 47. The final rising leader execution in Kilmainham was that of Sean MacDiarmada on the 12th. Paraphrasing the contents of his final letter, he was content with his death, as he believed he died so that the Irish nation may live on. The 2 major leaders to escape execution for their roles in the rising were Constance Markievicz and Éireann de Valera. Markievicz was initially sentenced to death, but was commuted on grounds of being a woman. The very outspoken feminist made it very clear that she would have preferred to have just been shot. De Valera was spared by virtue of being an American citizen, and the Brits were banking on the US entering the war, so shooting one would be a bad look. Michael Collins himself was initially among those marked for death, but he escaped this fate by literally walking to the other side of the room where he and a bunch of others were being held and keeping his head down. Tom Kent, a volunteer leader from Cork, was arrested after a shootout with the Royal Irish Constabulary at his home. He had stayed home after the uprising was called off. He was sentenced to death regardless, being shot on May 9th, making a clean 15. Roger Casement, the guy arrested before the rising for his German connection, was tried separately for treason in London, being hanged in early August. After the execution of MacDiarmada, the government finally put its foot down and directly ordered an end to the executions, realizing that a mistake had been made. The Easter Rising was on track to go down as yet another doomed Irish rebellion in a long line of doomed Irish rebellions. Instead, the heavy-handed British response had turned the unpopular and disgraced rebels into martyrs. In the coming months, support for the Republican movement exploded amongst the general public, with thousands flocking to nationalist organizations. To staunch the bleeding, the remaining uprising participants were spared the hangman's noose and imprisoned. Michael Collins was one of them. The vast majority of the rising participants were sentenced to hard labor in various camps around the British Isles. Michael Collins, for his part, was first detained at the Stafford detention barracks, where he was kept in solitary confinement for 3 weeks, before spending the month of June as a somewhat normal prisoner, allowed to write letters and do other human shit. Eventually, the British made the decision to centralize their prisoners somewhere they could be watched, and the Frongoch camp in Wales was picked for this task. Collins would be transferred here at the end of June, and very quickly moved to fill in the power vacuum left in the Irish nationalist movement. Notably, he started making a whole lot of friends in low places, and he took a step back and started thinking about the rising. He came to the conclusion that they had fucked up so bad that literally the only people to blame were themselves. The take-and-hold approach of conventional warfare was clearly not going to work when facing an enemy of such absurd numerical superiority, and so Collins began quietly developing some military ideas of his own. Fighting fair was a doomed endeavor, so why bother fighting fair? So anyways, Mao is a goddamn poser, and Collins is the real inventor of People's War doctrine. I run the channel, therefore, that is canon. In the meantime, Collins would be elected the IRB chief for the Frongoch camp. It wasn't super meaningful at the moment, since the IRB was basically destroyed and was a shadow of its former self, but it could still organize and transfer intel between various prison camps. Collins wasn't about to let the cause of Irish freedom go, not by a fucking long shot, and he swore that if he ever got out, he would do his damnedest to help put this operation back together. Other than that, though, he mostly just mulled around with his fellow inmates, playing sports and learning a bit of Welsh. As it turns out, there's not much to do in, fucking prison. The threat of conscription and general ill treatment did lead to conflict, though, resulting in a hunger strike and several dead prisoners, along with beatings and confinement for many more. Collins was able to smuggle out reports of this to various newspapers around the Isles, resulting in an absolute shitstorm of public outrage. Eventually, the British throw up their hands and say, fuck it, just go home. Can't deal with all the civilian unrest when we have a fucking world war to fight here. Thus, an amnesty of the Frongach prisoners was declared on December 21st of 1916. This could not possibly have consequences. The very first thing Collins did when arriving back in Dublin is get absolutely shit-faced like a Chad before hopping on a train back to Cork. He spent 3 weeks at home with his family, making up for a lot of lost time before returning to Dublin. During his time in prison, a couple of major things happened. One, the Americans got pissed over the whole executions thing and started threatening to not support Britain in the war over it. Oops. Second, Redmond and the IPP were rapidly bleeding support. Another attempt at home rule in late 1916 caused a kerfuffle when it was revealed that the new plan was to partition the island, and Redmond withdrew support as a result. However, the IPP was increasingly being seen as ineffective by many people, something that will have consequences in about a year. In the meantime, the Dublin Castle administration, the hand of the British government on the island, was busy absolutely falling over itself as a series of reshuffling struck after the Rising. Ironically, the Easter Rising, folly though it was, had set the stage almost perfectly for the comeback of the century. It began with a single step. Remember Plunkett? Well, he had a dad. Fucking obviously. Why did I say that? Dad Plunkett decided to run in a by-election for a parliamentary seat in County Roscommon as an independent against an incumbent IPP man. Collins sensed an opportunity and helped him on his campaign. He won pretty handily and, in a sign of things to come, declared his abstention from Parliament. In February, Collins became secretary of the Irish National Aid Fund, dedicated to helping out the families of those killed or executed in the Rising, where he catapulted himself to national significance through his sheer pencil-pushing prowess. While working, he also helped set up arms smuggling rings, reorganized the volunteers in the IRB, and began the process of hijacking Sinn Féin. That last part took some time, as many nationalists were still in prison, but those that had been released were signing up with Sinn Féin at an alarming rate, to the point that Arthur Griffith was becoming a minority voice in his own party. Sinn Féin was also experiencing a surge of popularity across Ireland, and the party actually had some weight to throw around. To show this, Collins turned his attention to another by-election, this time in County Longford, in May of 1917. Once again running against an IPP incumbent, it was determined that the man best suited to beat them on behalf of Sinn Féin was Joseph McGuinness, a man who was literally still in fucking jail at that point. Éamon de Valera, also still in jail, told him not to stand for the election because losing would be a bad look, but Michael Collins, being based, told him to go fuck himself and pulled some strings to have him run anyway. The campaign was run well, but this time they needed to utilize the Russian method of winning an election, i.e. one of Collins's buddies calmly walked up to the guy counting the votes and pointed a gun at his head. Lo and behold, a mythical pile of uncounted votes was found, and McGuinness won by a perfectly clean and not at all rigged 37 votes. Given the fact that he was, in jail, he couldn't take a seat at the moment, so that made 2 abstentions from Parliament. And, son of a bitch, the Sinn Féin abstention strategy pioneered by Hungary of all places was beginning to work. The British government, now of David Lloyd George, promptly had another panic attack. In an attempt to buy some goodwill with the rapidly growing Irish nationalist movement, the remaining Easter Rising prisoners were amnestied on June 15th. They may have left Ireland as disgraced terrorists, but they returned as veritable folk heroes, and a massive crowd gathered to welcome their return. This translated to results. The third by-election, contested by Sinn Féin in July, was run by the now free De Valera in County Clare, which he won massively. The volunteers had also rebounded, their ranks had surged, and they now served as militia guards for Sinn Féin organizers. In August, W.T. Cosgrave would win a by-election in Kilkenny. Collins, meanwhile, was up to his neck in administrative tasks, serving as the de facto quartermaster of the Irish Volunteers, the IRB, and increasingly, Sinn Féin itself. He was making plenty of friends and allies and a few notable enemies, namely De Valera and Cathal Brugha, who he disagreed with profoundly on the military tactics front. De Valera is a bloody character, to say the least. St. Patrick clearly didn't drive all the snakes out of Ireland because De Valera was still fucking there. I'll spare you the soap opera since this is a video on Collins, but what matters is that De Valera was, above all else, a born politician. Love him or hate him, he had a commanding presence, a mastery of being an absolute fucking weasel, and a willingness to compromise, asterisk unless that compromise involved a woman. There was a reason he was a mainstay of Irish politics until the 1970s. It would take everyone to help politic Sinn Féin into the driver's seat, but De Valera was utterly intent on making sure his name would be in front and center of the history books. In October of 1917, a large conference was held between all major Irish nationalist factions. After said politicking, Arthur Griffith agreed to resign from leadership of Sinn Féin in favor of De Valera, in exchange for becoming vice president of the party. Dad Plunkett also joined the party, by the way, so he's not independent anymore, in case you were wondering. As such, the Volunteers, Sinn Féin, and the IRB were all folded into each other. This party congress concluded with a declaration that Sinn Féin now stood for a free Irish republic, and that their candidates would contest every seat in Ireland during the next British general election. If they were to succeed, then the Sinn Féin MPs would abstain from taking their seats, which would guarantee electoral gridlock in the United Kingdom. Then, if all went well, a new, truly Irish legislature could be established. The time for talk had passed. Ireland would be freed by any means necessary. The Congress was immediately followed by a separate meeting of the Irish Volunteers. It unfortunately revealed somewhat of a power struggle at play between the IRB and the not IRB. De Valera was elected president, and Calabrua, the chief of staff, both of whom opposed the IRB and their shady tactics. Collins, for his part, was elected organizational director. De Valera, especially, was beginning to oppose the IRB and Collins by extension, increasingly believing that the correct play was to go big and loud. In his eyes, the IRB had already failed, and as such, he and Collins were constantly on each other's asses. Collins spent the beginning of 1918 continuing to make friends, this time with a series of detectives in the RIC, who were more than happy to sell out the British for him. They granted him intimate knowledge of how the RIC worked, which would prove invaluable for the war he himself was about to fight against the British. By the end of 1918, through shrewd deal-making and carefully placed moles, Collins had basically built a ring of spies in the British government and police structure of Ireland. This gave him unprecedented control of information, something that will have relevance in a bit. In the meantime, the British were determined to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Thomas Ashe, a Sinn Féin member and one of Collins's friends, was beaten to death by his jailers in Mountjoy prison after the hunger strike he and his fellow inmates were on was broken through the policy of force-feeding. This was promptly made public and caused a shitstorm across Ireland, with 30,000 people attending his funeral. The big thing, however, was conscription. The British, like most of the combatants in World War I, were running out of bodies. As such, efforts were made in 1918 to introduce conscription to Ireland, something that they had been exempt from previously. This was not received well by anyone. Seriously, even the Unionists were like, what the fuck, dude? Despite the backlash, the British government passed an act in April that enabled conscription in Ireland. This led to a gargantuan general strike and created common ground between the rapidly faltering IPP and Sinn Féin. The British government, in response, started cracking down on the Irish people in general, banning things like sports matches, Irish language classes, and instituting even harsher curfews. They then decided that Sinn Féin was clearly the problem, inventing the German plot in May as an excuse to arrest most of the party's leadership. Collins, having his connections, knew about these intended arrests beforehand and tried to warn everyone, but this time the Brits got lucky and folks didn't listen to him. As such, most of their leadership was in jail again by the end of May. Conscription ended up never actually being enforced because they were smart enough to realize that things would get violent if they did, so they were content to not send the Irish to die for an English war for the moment. All of this had not exactly ingratiated the Irish to their Anglo overlords. On November 11th, the nanosecond the war ended, the Volunteers attacked a bunch of British soldiers during armistice celebrations turned riots, wounding over 100 while actively egged on by the Irish. Then, an election was immediately called. Sinn Féin's time had come. Since everyone was in jail, Collins had become the de facto party leader, and as such made damn sure that Sinn Féin was represented in every city, town, and fucking hamlet on the island. A solid half of the party's members that stood for election were in prison at the time of the election, but that didn't matter. 117 years of direct rule from London and the efforts of Irishmen to set their country free culminated in the election of December 14th, 1918. Sinn Féin swept. They took 73 of Ireland's seats, relegating the IPP to the dustbin of history. Michael Collins himself won a seat for South Cork, making the man that could do basically anything now also a politician. A clearer message could not have been sent to the suits in London. Among these MPs was Constance Markievicz, who was ironically the first woman to be elected to British Parliament. In line with policy, none of the Sinn Féin MPs turned up when Parliament was reconvened. Instead, they followed through on their promises. A flurry of meetings of Sinn Féin brass were held that laid the groundwork for what would come to be called the Dáil Éireann, the Assembly of Ireland. The first Dáil met on January 21st of 1919. In a ceremonial act, much of this meeting was conducted in Irish Gaelic, a language that had nearly gone extinct due to English bans on its practice. The meeting on that day in January was comparatively simple. Only 29 names were recorded as present, since the majority were still in prison. Cathal Brugha was elected Speaker and de facto President due to De Valera and Griffith's absences, a role that would be turned over after they were released. The agenda primarily consisted of paperwork surrounding future government departments and cabinet appointments. Finally, the independence of an Irish Republic was declared. They didn't declare the independence of a specific geographic region, but simply declared it for the Irish nation and her people. For now, this independence existed mostly on paper. The Brits were not about to let their first colony get away so easily, and they retained military and central political control over the island. As such, attention was turned to defending this proclamation. Over the coming months, efforts were undertaken to fully integrate the Irish volunteers with the new Irish government for purposes of coordination. Over the course of 1919, they would be professionalized and centralized, whipped into a proper fighting force. Now, instead of an affiliated militia group, the volunteers could call themselves an army. An Irish Republican Army, or IRA, for those who like acronyms. And, of course, the Dáil needed to act like a government that seemed like it could represent the Irish people. It started passing laws and establishing government systems, despite not technically even existing, according to the Brits. The name of the game was legitimacy, and as time went on, people started to acknowledge them as an actual force. But, of course, shit was not going to be easy. The very day the first Dáil convened in County Tipperary, the solo headbag ambush occurred, where 4 IRA men acting on their own attacked and killed 2 RIC officers. This would prove to be the inciting incident of the Irish War of Independence. Now, this war would be very, very far from conventional. The IRA and the British Army were nowhere near each other in terms of armament and numbers. The Brits could mobilize tens of thousands of regulars along with thousands more regular police and RIC officers and detectives. Meanwhile, the IRA spent the first year and a half with less than 10,000 poorly equipped men. So, given this absurd balancing situation, how the fuck did the IRA pull a win out of their asses? Their main problem was the numbers game. To answer this, the IRA could look to ancient history. In the immortal words of the great Fabius Maximus, just don't fucking fight them, forehead. The IRA decided to simply employ Fabian's strategy, also known as 4D chess, to break a superior enemy force by simply denying them the fight they were looking for. Instead of picking fights with British regulars, they would attack considerably weaker RIC officers, supply depots, barracks, undermanned and isolated positions, etc. They became masters of the hit and run, the assassination, and the night raid. When fights with the army had to happen, the IRA fought using the terrain to their advantage, with the rolling hills and vast rural spaces serving as perfect locations for laying traps and ambushes. The British may whine about honor and fighting dirty, but when the freedom of the nation is at stake, fighting fair is for fucking idiots. As a result, despite the British having a massive numbers advantage, actual battles rarely involved more than 50 or 60 people total, with large battles only involving a few hundred, and casualties were comparatively tiny. But the point was to nullify British numbers while playing to their own strengths, while piling enough corpses to inflict a death by 1,000 cuts. Mr. Burns stepping on ant.png. To achieve this, the IRA adopted the strategy of the flying column, a tiny, highly mobile force of light infantry and irregulars, usually no more than 30 or so men, that could fly around the backcountry, dictate terms of engagement, fuck the absolute shit out of either the slower and heavier British Army formations or the much smaller and under-equipped RIC units, and then bounce before reinforcements arrive. This strategy would be bolstered by a very heavy usage of spies and espionage to deliver paralyzing strikes right at the heart of British authority, breaking down their resolve and their command and control capabilities. Whenever the British caught the IRA out in the open, the IRA tended to lose very badly, and British follow-up raids on IRA men were often successful, but they just couldn't catch them out in the open as often as would be required for purely military victory to be a valid long-term strategy. This forced them to fight the espionage war, something that the Irish had an absolute advantage in, as we will soon see. The IRA's other big tactic was simply utilizing the population of Ireland. The Brits did not take well to losing, and many IRA wins would be followed by a British attack on random civilians. This drove the population into the arms of the IRA, and they began sheltering and informing for their fighters en masse. British atrocities also played into IRA propaganda efforts. Broadcasting news of British crimes and IRA victories caused both surges in recruitment and a rapid fall-off of support for the British, both at home and abroad. In effect, despite the island remaining under the de jure control of the British, it increasingly slid out of their control despite their overwhelming military presence. Collins would play a massive role in the war. The man had an essentially unmatched work ethic. Karl Brugge may have been the elected leader of the IRA, but Collins was the guy actually running the show and was also later made director of intelligence for the army. He was also appointed Minister of Finance by De Valera and did other shit in what little free time he had, like organizing assassinations, starting newspapers, securing loans, and other fun things. Oh, and he was elected president of the IRB, although that particular organization was increasingly defunct as the actual government got established. Immediately following the beginning of the war, his first goals were getting the IRA armed and trained and breaking as many Sinn Féiners out of jail as physically possible. On February 3rd, he organized and personally aided in the escape of De Valera and others from Lincoln Jail over in England by literally smuggling keys in fucking cakes. I am not making that up. In March and April, he organized further breakouts from Mountjoy, and in October, smashed a group out of Strangeways Prison. When people were inevitably rearrested, chances are Collins would not be far behind. With De Valera out, the Dáil would meet again several times in April, where further discussions were had about the nature of things going forward. It was also determined around now that De Valera would fuck off to the United States in June in an attempt to secure recognition and financing, with a few of Collins's boys smuggling him across. He managed to raise over $5 million during his year and a half or so, although he would end up siphoning about half of it for his own business purposes, but failed to get the recognition he wanted. This was partially because De Valera's ego was fucking massive, and all he did was piss off basically every important person he came across. Several other attempts at securing foreign backing were made. Envoys were sent to the Paris Peace Conference, and Collins met with an American official as part of a report on the Irish situation that was commissioned by Woodrow Wilson, but again, not a whole lot came out of this for the time being. In early April, he and a couple buddies staged a night raid on the RIC offices on Brunswick Street, where they spent a few hours rifling through files and records that notably spoiled basically everything the RIC detectives planned to do, and gave up the identities and locations of a bunch of their agents. He used this information to launch his first shots of the War of Independence, having half a dozen officers murdered by his goons. Of course, though, if you're gonna wage a guerrilla war in a way that borders on terrorism, you gotta have branding. As such, on September 19th, the Squad was formed. There is no fancy way to say it. It was a hit squad. Using his network of informants in the RIC and the Dublin Castle, Collins and his boys would learn of a spy trying to poke around, or an officer who was being a jackass to Irish citizens, or a detective trying to get one up on them, or an informant in the ranks of the IRA, and they would go and kill them. The brutal simplicity of the Squad was only matched by how ludicrously effective they were. It was nicknamed the 12 Apostles, based on the original 12 members. The number grew as the war went on, but they are directly responsible for the killings of dozens of people. Usually, when the kill order was given, their targets would be given a choice: retire, go home and stop being a problem, or die. Many stopped being problems, and many more died. That said, they still followed reasonable ethics. Anyone who was not explicitly a target was off limits, a policy that was enforced by Collins personally, although this was not always followed. Their actions were further aided by the increasingly nationalistic Irish population, with many ordinary people serving as informants and smugglers for them. They were so effective that not only were they considerably hindering British intelligence, but the very name of Michael Collins became virtually synonymous with death. He, on occasion, would send letters to prominent members of the RIC, and everyone knew Michael Collins' name. He was the most wanted man in Ireland by the end of 1920, and every single RIC detective knew that. If you received a letter signed by Michael Collins, that meant he knew who you were and knew where you lived. And if the RIC knew anything, it was that Collins and the Squad very rarely missed. This tactic worked so well that some more antsy RIC men would just straight up flee the fucking country after an interaction with Collins, so afraid were they of falling on the wrong end of the Reaper's chosen horsemen. As such, Collins and his squad became the boogeyman for the RIC, and their operations were absolutely crippled. And the funniest part is, Collins was just so unbelievably brazen. Like, he was public enemy number one, and he just kept living his life. He went out with the lads, gave the occasional public speech, visited friends and family, and went to church every Sunday without fail. You'd think the Brits could capitalize on this information, but apparently not. The man had balls so massive that they actively shattered the willpower of Anglos in his presence. I can definitely respect the hustle. Of course, the rest of the IRA was not idle. More opportunistic leaders around the country gradually started ambushing British units, attacking barracks and supply depots, and seizing strong points to fight pitched battles akin to those of Easter 1916. This ramping up of violence caused the Brits to react accordingly. On September 12th, the Dáil, along with Sinn Féin, were declared illegal and had their offices raided, forcing the dispersal of the fledgling government. This was responded to with several high-profile assassinations, triggering the British government to start taking the Ireland crisis seriously. They were intent to decide Ireland's future their way, home rule or not, and as such moved to outright crush any dissent on the island. Reinforcements to the badly undermanned RIC began flooding in, as the new decade of 1920 was celebrated with the IRA sacking and looting of 3 barracks in County Cork. These reinforcements took multiple forms, but the most notable set came to be known to history as the Black and Tans. The Black and Tans were a colloquial term for the new set of RIC volunteers that came from Britain starting in January of 1920. They were overwhelmingly recruited from unemployed ex-World War I servicemen as a means of reinforcing the outmatched and underfunded RIC. The nickname Black and Tan came from the clothing they wore. The shortage of actual RIC uniforms led to them donning a mixture of the dark green or black regular RIC uniform and tan British Army khaki uniforms. They were under the jurisdiction of the RIC, but were given a lot of leeway with how they dealt with IRA men. This tended to revolve around killing innocent people and shooting up towns in reprisal for IRA attacks. As such, the term Black and Tan became basically synonymous with savagery and barbarism. The other major formation was that of the Auxiliary Division, partially the idea of Winston Churchill himself. The primary differences between them and the Black and Tans were that they were recruited from officers instead of regular soldiers, and that they were their own separate formation within the RIC rather than just regular RIC men in funny uniforms. Compared to the Tans, they were on average far deadlier, more disciplined, and braver, serving as formidable opposition to the IRA, although they were responsible for their own slew of atrocities against civilians. They started popping up in June and July of 1920, and in just a few short months showed themselves to be complete assholes. There was also the Ulster Special Constabulary set up in October, but they aren't super relevant for this video, although the B Specials, as they were dubbed, would be a big part of major events in Ulster down the line. The IRA definitely had their work cut out for them. Later in January, Ireland held municipal elections, returning massive wins for Sinn Féin across the board, including in Ulster, where the Protestants were dealt a critical political blow by the election of a Catholic mayor in the city of Derry. Many of these municipalities subsequently declared political loyalty to the ousted Dáil, causing violence to ramp even further. On March 17th of 1920, a group of armed RIC men stormed the home of the Lord Mayor of Cork, the newly elected Thomas MacCurtain, and murdered him in front of his wife. This murder made headlines across the Isles and looked really bad for the British, and Collins responded with a series of killings of his own. These results, especially the concerning turnout in Ulster, caused what remained of the UVF to re-enter the game, this time fully willing to fight the IRA. Ulster itself had a mini civil war of its own, with the UVF and IRA clashing repeatedly. Massacres of Catholic civilians by the UVF were returned with attacks on Protestants. In Derry itself, the month of June 1920 saw open warfare between the two, sparked by the UVF opening fire on a crowd of Catholic civilians. A brutal bloodletting followed, claiming the lives of many, including a 10-year-old boy. The violence only ended when the British Army arrived in force and cracked down on both sides. In the meantime, Collins was dodging attempts on his own life left, right, and fucking center. Every new RIC bigwig that put Collins on their radar was outmaneuvered in an unironic who-must-go situation. Case in point, the British sent a Secret Service agent named Jameson after the guy with the help of a Belfast police commissioner named Redmond. Jameson was one of the Secret Service's smartest agents and was a real charming and trustworthy looking guy, and by LARPing as a communist, he managed to worm his way right to Collins himself. Collins, being kind of a smart guy, not only managed to dodge being ensnared by Jameson 3 separate times with the help of agents of his own within the RIC, but used these agents to ascertain the identities of Jameson and the commissioner and had the squad killed both of them in broad daylight. Redmond died like a bitch, but Jameson was based enough to freely admit he had been outmaneuvered and stood at attention for his executioners. Basically, every attempt on Collins' life ended pretty much the same way, and apart from a few close calls, he was absolutely running circles around British intelligence in a way many fully funded intelligence agencies could only dream of. His agents basically knew everything, even straight up infiltrating the Secret Service itself at one point. Every now and then, an informant or an agent or an incognito constabulary member would just fucking die, and all they could really do was go, ah shucks, that bloody Collins and his League of Assassins again, probably. All that said, Collins himself was going kinda stir-crazy because of all the killing and all the brushes with death. His unstoppable work ethic was actively harming his relationship with many of his squad mates who were going days without sleep and having their conscience tormented by the amount of ranked competitive homicide they were doing. He would belt your ass for being late or failing to do something on time. Collins was particularly prone to aggressive emotional outbursts when people weren't doing things as efficiently as he would have liked. He also had borderline manic episodes before and after particularly stressful hit missions due to the fact that he, ironically, didn't have much of a stomach for killing, and he became an insufferable jackass to basically everyone around him to the point that he got in spitting matches with his own comrades. But he still got it done. He was still a very smart guy and an inspiring presence to many, and his charisma never faltered. For all his issues, he got the job done, and a great many people came to respect his authority utterly. Meanwhile, the war dragged on and on. Strikes broke out in April to protest the incarceration of several IRA men, which were responded to with a massacre in County Clare. Bernard Montgomery, yes, that one, was busy committing war crimes in County Cork, all the while skirmish after skirmish caused the death tolls to start mounting. RIC reprisals began targeting the economic base of the Irish people, burning creameries, farms, small businesses, mills, housing, factories, and more. Other times, they would walk into a town and start shooting indiscriminately as revenge for the murder of a black and tan. Hundreds of innocent civilians, many of whom were women and children, were caught in the crossfire as the British desperately tried to regain control of the situation in the country. Whenever an RIC man was killed in a Protestant town, the UVF would fan the flames of vicious anti-Catholic riots that saw many beaten or killed. IRA men that were captured were often subject to horrific torture. Every atrocity only drove the general populace further into the arms of Sinn Féin and the IRA, but they weren't exactly saints either. At the insistence of Karl Brugge, the IRA returned the favor in October and November, going to England and putting dozens of warehouses, homes, and businesses to the torch in reprisal. The IRA was also known for taking very few prisoners, and summary executions were very common. While Collins attempted to avoid civilian casualties, oftentimes they would get caught in the crossfire, and many an assassination also came with the deaths of the people that happened to be in their general area around the same time. Some more extreme Catholic members would even go as far as to enact reprisals of their own on Protestant civilians. Overall, a terrible conflict. One that was about to get a whole lot worse. Starting in October, Collins had a sort of 1v1 with a British intelligence unit called the Cairo Gang. The gang definitely came the closest to bagging him, but close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, and after they succeeded in knocking off a few of Collins's buddies, he struck back hard. On the morning of November 21st, the IRA assassinated 19 people in Dublin, breaking into their homes. Some were shot dead in their beds, others shot dead eating breakfast, and others caught with their pants down quite literally. This move absolutely beheaded the RIC's intelligence network in the city and permanently removed the Cairo Gang as a threat. Upon this stinging defeat, the RIC went mad. The GAA was hosting a Gaelic football match in Croke Park, and despite Collins frantically asking them to call it off for fear of the inevitable, there were already far too many people there. The Black and Tans arrived on the scene to ostensibly conduct a sweep for suspected Sinn Féiners. What they did instead was open fire on the crowd and the players in the middle of the game. 14 people, including one player and multiple children, were killed, and another 100 plus would be wounded. This came to be known as Bloody Sunday. The shooting made international headlines and threatened to destroy Britain's international reputation, even amongst her own allies. It also irreparably drove the Irish public into the arms of Sinn Féin and the IRA, and any hope of Britain retaining control over the island outside of just straight up committing genocide essentially disappeared. The following week, on the 28th, the flying column of Tom Barry ambushed a unit of the Auxiliary Division near the village of Kilmainham, slaughtering them to the man. Later on the 10th of December, British forces razed a sizable portion of Cork City in reprisal for more killings. Michael Collins would even see his own childhood home at Woodfield torched in April of 1921. In May of 1921, at the urging of De Valera, who had returned from the US, the IRA launched a very public and dramatic attack on the Customs House building in Dublin. Now, he's kind of a moron, and he wanted to fight a propaganda war by scoring big military victories despite the IRA being utterly unsuited for the task. They succeeded in blowing up the Customs House, but took nearly 100 casualties in the event. After this, Collins's autonomy was shredded when the squad was forced under the command of the Dublin Brigade, hindering its effectiveness and really pissing Collins off. Despite all this, the war dragged on and on. Everyone was completely exhausted. The British were suffering higher casualties than the IRA overall, and it was getting harder and harder to find volunteers for the RIC, which by this point had its morale crushed thoroughly by Collins. In its efforts to contain the IRA, it had become an absolutely monolithic, bureaucratic mess of an organization defined by paranoia and mistrust. The increasing number of British regulars on the island had also caused costs of the war to skyrocket, a situation that exacerbated the country's already fragile finances caused by World War I. And, of course, Britain's international reputation was in tatters. The IRA's position was not much better. They had suffered multiple stinging defeats in the early months of 1921 and simply could not hope to match the numbers the British could bring. Furthermore, they were badly undersupplied, struggling to get sufficient weapons and ammunition to fight at full effectiveness. The fact that horrific reprisals against civilians tended to follow IRA victories was also not lost on the civilian population, and the continuation of the war threatened to gradually wipe out their support base. The two sides had, in essence, forced themselves into a stalemate. It was just a matter of who would blink first. Shockingly enough, the answer was the British. Initial peace talks in December of 1920 went nowhere because London demanded that the IRA be disarmed as a condition, which was flatly rejected. Funnily enough, real peace action came from the king of all people. A separate parliament was opened in Ulster in June because they figured partition was basically inevitable by this point, and the king gave a cute little speech advocating for peace and cooperation. Of all fucking things, this actually worked. PM Lloyd George sent an appeal to De Valera proposing talks, and De Valera would accept. Finally getting somewhere, the IRA, RIC, and British Army hammered out a truce that took effect on July 11th, ending the bloodshed but allowing the IRA to keep their arms. Collins had some pretty barbarous backup plans for if this didn't work, including some mass murder of his own, but these were obviously shelved. Thus began many months of riding the tiger of diplomacy. The British were already rearming, and Lloyd George made it very clear to everyone that if talks broke down, war would resume, and this time the Brits intended to win it. The first set of British proposals came out in mid-July. Dominion status and partition were the main sticking point, and after the Dáil met in early August to discuss, this first set was rejected. That said, most in the Dáil were by this point willing to acknowledge that if they got independence, the Northeast probably wasn't coming with them. As negotiations went on, it also became clear that the Irish weren't in a great bargaining position, as the British remained firm on most of their demands, but they did agree to release prisoners, which was nice. The fundamental point Lloyd George was making was that they would utterly refused to accept dealings with an Irish republic. Ireland was not legally independent, and despite the bloodshed, they had no intention of giving Ireland true independence. In their eyes, they were dealing with the potential future government of a Dominion of Ireland. De Valera, admittedly, tried his best to achieve recognition to some degree, but his hands were absolutely tied. So on August 20th, he said fuck it, looked to Collins, and said, guess who's going to London to negotiate? Collins, being absolutely not a diplomat and also being on Britain's shit list, protested this decision, but eventually acquiesced. For all his strengths as a person, Collins was not the guy for this job. Literally everyone knew this, including De Valera, but he was more interested in controlling the home front than he was negotiating for peace. In many ways, it was a calculated political gambit. No matter what Collins and the negotiators signed, it would be unpopular. De Valera also very specifically set the team up for some degree of failure by putting people who fundamentally disagreed with Collins on it. While Arthur Griffith and Éamon Duggan were on a similar level to the guy, Robert Barton and George Duffy were very much not. If you were wondering if De Valera will ever get comeuppance for his slimy dipshit activities, the answer is no. The point was absolutely to remove Collins from the game, so to speak, and when he inevitably came back with a shit deal, De Valera could capitalize on it politically. The negotiations began on October 11th. The British were represented by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, as well as Lord Birkenhead, Austen Chamberlain, Gordon Hewitt, Hamar Greenwood, Lamming Worthington Evans, and, of course, Winston Churchill. I would give untold subsidies to be a fly on the wall for these negotiations. To say the Irish were out of their element amongst the veritable political hit squad that was the British delegation would be an understatement. The British had an absolute advantage in statecraft and diplomacy, and Lloyd George did not hesitate to make that clear. That all said, the Irish held their own. Collins himself would end negotiations being damn near respected by basically the entire British government, especially Churchill. Hell, the two even got a couple pints together at his house at one point after an off-the-books negotiation session that involved just a little bit of alcohol. The negotiations dragged for over 2 months, with many meetings, conferences, and Ulster threatening to revolt if they were forced into an all-Irish parliament. Fun times. With nobody budging, Collins warmed up to the idea of Dominion status. He figured it was the only way the Brits would let Ireland go, and by mid-November, he and Griffith had basically accepted this. Eventually, the British submitted a revised set of proposals, which Collins and crew took back to Dublin for a cabinet debate. A few amendments were made to the economic and defense sections of the proposal. The team went back to England. They were rejected again before the talks broke down. Collins got them restarted before one final series of negotiations would succeed. The Irish pulled considerable concessions regarding national defense, including being allowed to maintain a navy and air force, and notably, the new Irish state would not be locked into free trade with Britain. The treaty they settled on covered a whole bunch of shit, but there were a few important things. Ireland would be granted Dominion status in line with that of Canada, which is the specific example that is used, which included legislative independence. As such, Ireland would also have an appointed Governor-General, and all Irish politicians would need to swear an oath to the king. 6 of the 9 counties of Ulster were allowed to vote to be excluded from the new Irish state, and a boundary commission would be set up to determine how the border in the north would look if this occurred. They obviously voted to be excluded. Britain would retain control over the ports of Berehaven and Lough Swilly, as well as the fortress and harbour facilities of Spike Island off the coast of Cove. And the new Irish state would assume its part of the British national debt. In exchange, Ireland got legislative and some diplomatic independence, as well as being allowed to raise its own military. It was formally signed on December 6th of 1921, and after some pushback in both governments, it was eventually ratified by the end of December. The Irish delegation, and especially Collins, were not happy with the treaty as it stood. Collins knew damn well that the hardliners back in Ireland would be up in fucking arms over it. Ireland would be divided, still be nominally subservient to the United Kingdom, and would not be a republic. The British were equally unenthused. Radical wings of the Conservative Party and the Unionist population would see it as a betrayal of the British Empire and those who died to keep Ireland leashed. It would take less than 24 hours for prominent Ulster Protestant politicians to threaten armed revolt over the signing. Regardless, war would be prevented. The ink hit the pages at 2:30 a.m. Lord Birkenhead remarked, "I may have signed my political death warrant tonight." This proved very true. Every British signatory of the treaty would fall from power in the next 12 months. Collins, in a moment of impressive foresight, responded, "I may have signed my actual death warrant." But that was it. With some strings attached, Ireland was free. The Irish people had achieved their centuries-long quest for self-determination. This was cause for celebration, right? Were it so easy. The first word the Dáil threw at Collins was traitor. Markievicz accused Collins of banging a British noblewoman in exchange for the title of Governor of Ireland, which is extra funny because by this point Collins had fallen madly in love with a woman named Kitty Kiernan. He and Griffith were also accused of, among other things, being drunk when they signed, such an insult to the very ideals that the Republicans fought and died for. Collins snapped back, firmly believing that it was a choice between a raw deal or further death inflicted on the Irish people. Or, as he put it, the treaty gave Ireland the freedom to achieve freedom. The hardliner faction, led by, go fucking figure, Éireann de Valera, strongly disagreed. De Valera himself did everything in his power to paint Collins and Griffith as people who went AWOL and signed the treaty without the consent of he himself, despite the fact that he himself was not in London during the actual hard work. All that said, amongst the common Irish people and a significant faction of the government led by W.T. Cosgrave, there was an impressive amount of support. It prevented further deaths and it gave Ireland a hope for a future without Britain in it. This was further reinforced by Collins giving a fiery and impassioned speech to the masses defending his decision, the popular and media response being overwhelmingly positive. This allowed Collins to throw the book at De Valera, and the treaty was eventually, reluctantly, ratified, but not before De Valera and the anti-treaty faction attempted to basically subvert the will of the people and act unilaterally trying to get it shut down, intimidating and bribing members of the Dáil. The final vote was 64 in favor and 57 against, giving the treaty an edge above a mere 7 votes. De Valera promptly resigned. Collins and Griffith made calls for unity, Brugha fucked off to ensure the IRA remained disciplined, and literally everyone in the Dáil was unhappy with the current state of things. The treaty was ratified on January 8th of 1922, and 2 days later, De Valera and his faction bailed. Griffith was elected in his stead, and a new cabinet was established of the pro-treaty bigwigs they still had. A provisional government was declared on the 14th, with Collins being elected its first transitional chairman, and Dublin Castle was handed over 2 days later. Collins oversaw the handover, and when an official got pissy that he was 7 minutes late, Collins reportedly responded, "We've been waiting 700 years, you can have the 7 minutes. Holy fucking based. We could only dream of having such absolute chads like Collins around in this day and age. But yeah, I don't want to gloss over the fact that Collins was the boss now. A man like him will surely have a long and successful political career, right? A constitutional committee was created on the 22nd, with Collins providing the advice of, "Please, for the love of God, do not reference Britain in any way, shape, or form, because if you do, our country will split apart." The country was about to split apart anyway. The IRA collapsed almost immediately. The anti-treaty IRA fucked off into the countryside and basically stopped responding to orders, with some groups starting up localized terror campaigns against pro-treaty forces, while the pro-treaty side was reinforced with as many new recruits as the provisional government could physically manifest. The IRA in Limerick went as far as to threaten to establish a military dictatorship. They would also seize a British ship full of weapons in early April, which was of grave concern to basically everyone. They also went out of their way to spook Collins by harassing him at rallies and even tried to assassinate him on multiple occasions, but he was simply too base to fall victim to such pitiful attempts. Finally, tensions came to a head. On April 14th, IRA forces seized the forecourts and several other locations around Dublin. They kind of just sat there, menacingly, and Collins hesitated. He now had a problem. His only real option to dislodge them was to shoot his own comrades. As such, he hesitated, and the IRA sat there. De Valera, meanwhile, went around the country making inflammatory speeches and screaming about Collins and the provisional government, which absolutely did not help matters. Attempts at a peaceful resolution were largely unsuccessful, and IRA commanders began planning for open conflict. This was immediately followed by a very contentious election on June 16th, which saw the pro-treaty faction of Collins and Griffith absolutely dominate the anti-treaty faction, and also saw the emergence of other political parties that don't really matter. What this election did was permanently split Sinn Féin. Collins and his allies were essentially a different party by this point, and as such, the organization would spiral downwards. The IRA did not take this loss particularly well. On the 22nd, Sir Henry Wilson, a respected military figure and one of the guys trying to defuse the Ulster shit show. Side note, Collins was also funding the IRA in Northern Ireland and fighting a guerrilla campaign the entire time, going as far as to kidnap several notable Unionist leaders, while the UVF and B Specials encouraged and committed crimes against Catholics. History tends to rhyme, and Collins grew increasingly ready to throw hands with the British Army. Wilson was fucking assassinated by the IRA. After this, Churchill rang up Collins and politely asked him to kill them. Do it. You know you want to. Fire on the forecourts. Consolidate power. Honor the treaty. Do it or I will walk my fat ass over there and burn those buildings down for you, and then you will look like a British pawn. British heroes bleed on British soil. Show us whose side you are on. After the IRA kidnapped one of Collins's boys, he snapped. The morning of Wednesday the 28th, an ultimatum was sent to the forecourts garrison to surrender. This was ignored, and Collins had artillery brought up, firing the first shots of the Irish Civil War. Forecourts fell in 2 days, with fighting over central Dublin lasting until July 5th. The Easter Rising was replayed to an almost farcical degree, but this time it was brother against brother. Those who had fought together that Easter week now fought each other. The most notable casualty was Cathal Brugha, of all people, killed in rearguard action after the IRA evacuated O'Connell Street. Despite the two never getting along, Collins was absolutely distraught with his death, and he became further distraught at the killings of some of his best friends and former squad mates. His resolve would harden over the coming days, however. The die had been cast, the Rubicon crossed. The only thing left was blood. Churchill immediately started funneling as many guns as physically possible into the provisional government as the Irish National Army went on the offensive across the island. Michael Collins was promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the army, and he flexed his skill in open battles. Limerick, Sligo, Tipperary, Waterford, Cork, Cashel, Westport all fell after fierce fighting, forcing the IRA back into the guerrilla war it was so accustomed to. Collins's main goal was making the National Army something that could fight well, and thus rigorous training and campaigns of discipline were launched. He sent officers to Switzerland to observe their methods, and even managed to have a few conversations with the one and only Lawrence of Arabia to learn from his military tactics. All the while, he remained head of government. One moment he was supervising military training, the next he was issuing decrees, sending letters, doing paperwork. He and his ministers were constantly shot at by guerrillas, all while the war began to tear the country asunder. It's very hard to justify shooting your own countrymen to a population, and as such, morale on both sides was low. The population did remain firmly on the side side of the Free State for now, but how long would that hold out as their neighbors, friends, colleagues slaughtered each other in the Civil War that seemed increasingly pointless? Arthur Griffith, the architect of Sinn Féin, succumbed to the stress, suffering a brain hemorrhage on August 12th and passing away. Collins led the funeral procession on the 16th, soldiering through despite his mental state declining rapidly from overwork and stress and suffering from a stomach ulcer. His ability to carry out his duties became increasingly questionable, but he did his damnedest. After the funeral, Collins endeavored to visit Cork as a part of a tour of inspection to boost morale and conduct some official business, but also just to stop by Clonakilty and the remains of his home for the first time in a while. He visited many places, saw his sister and his nephew, and saw his mood improve quite considerably. He even caught wind of peace offerings through the grapevine, which was even better. On August 22nd, he set off for a tour of West Cork. This was very strong IRA territory, but he brought a very small escort, presumably to move quickly from place to place. They moved through several small towns and villages, stopped at a pub for a pint, visited more towns where he was universally greeted as a hero, before traveling up the road that led through a small valley near the village of Bealnabla. While driving through, shots rang out. The driver of the car Collins was in wanted a speedy getaway, but Collins wanted to stand and fight. A firefight ensued, and after the IRA ambushers began to flee, Collins encouraged his men to continue the route. He stepped out of cover to get a better view of the fleeing men. Moments later, a bullet struck his head at the base of his skull. Michael Collins was dead a few minutes later. He was 31 years old. Yeah. Just like that. A man with a life ahead of him at the wrong place at the wrong time, snuffed out. There was never an official inquiry into the ambush, so there are conflicting reports about who actually shot him. It is generally ascribed to an ex-British Army sniper named Sonny O'Neill, but there are theories that it was an inside job by either someone in a high place bribing one of his escorts to do it, or one of them doing it out of Republican sympathies. Other claims blame the British Secret Service for the deed. The ambush itself was a stroke of impossible luck on behalf of the IRA. They sat on the hillside all day until most of them went home, leaving only 6. Of the 6, one was trying to disarm a road mine when Collins rolled up and subsequently jumped into a ditch. Collins' escort had a machine gun with them that suffered a jam at the worst possible moment, and Collins himself stepped into the open to allow for the fatal shot to be taken. One account states that the primary mastermind was none other than De Valera. However, he did not want Collins killed. He practically begged the ambushers to not go through with it, as the plan was just to meet with Collins to discuss terms. However, other accounts believe that De Valera was the one who would eventually bribe the guy into betraying Collins. Regardless of what happened, he was now dead. Fundamentally, Collins was cut down too soon. He had all sorts of plans for Ireland, including a cultural and economic revival for after the Civil War ended, but ironically, dying young meant that he died without too much to stain his legacy. He was laid in state for 3 days in Dublin and had his funeral mass in St. Mary's Church and would be buried in Glasnevin Cemetery, sharing the land with the likes of Daniel O'Connell, Charles Stewart Parnell, and dozens of other notable figures in the Irish campaign for freedom. His funeral procession through Dublin was attended by upwards of 500,000 people from across Ireland, wishing to pay their final respects to the man they considered a liberator. W.T. Cosgrave took over as provisional chairman of the provisional government, overseeing the passing of the 1922 Constitution and the formal establishment of the Irish Free State. The pro-treaty side would break from Sinn Féin and establish the Cumann na nGaedheal, a new political party that would run Ireland for the first years after her independence. The IRA gradually bled to death during the Civil War, losing popular support and suffering many military setbacks, culminating with the death or imprisonment of most of its leadership. The Free State used many tactics similar to those used by the British to break their resolve. A ceasefire was called in May of 1923, and after several months of political maneuvers, the IRA largely broke. De Valera, the Snake of Ireland himself, would emerge very well off. In 1926, he split Sinn Féin again, founding Fianna Fáil, acknowledging the treaty and entering the Dáil. Sinn Féin was relegated to a minor party that was effectively controlled by the considerably weakened IRA before the organization itself was banned. The IRA would slink into the darkness, biding its time, and would come to focus its efforts on a very different cause. Sinn Féin would eventually see a resurgence and continues to operate as a sizable force in Irish politics. On the other end, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, having fulfilled its duty, largely fell out of relevance after 1919. The final president would be Richard Mulcahy, replacing Collins after his death. The organization would be disbanded in 1924 after a purge of their members in the army. After the Statute of Westminster severed the dominions from Britain in 1931, Fianna Fáil would rise to power and De Valera repudiated most of the treaty. In 1937, a new constitution was shoved through that reworked the Irish government into a presidential republic republic in all but name. A year later, Britain withdrew from the treaty ports and handed them over to the Irish government. Come in the Dáil would merge with other like-minded factions to form Fine Gael in 1933 to act as a counterbalance for Fianna Fáil, and these two parties dominate Irish politics to this day. Eventually, De Valera would get his Irish Republic, with the Republic of Ireland Act formally declaring Ireland to be so. With its passing, Ireland had used her freedom and had achieved freedom once and for all. Just don't look at the Northeast. Not fucking touching that just yet. And finally, what of Michael Collins? De Valera and Irish politics in general attempted to sort of smother his legacy, however it grew far beyond what anyone could control. Michael Collins, great hero of Ireland, cut down before his time. As such, Ireland is covered with statues and memorials dedicated to him. His grave occupies a very prominent position in Glasnevin, and it is host to money, trinkets, and flowers left every single day from people all around the world, including myself, actually. There are multiple museums dedicated to him in County Cork, one of which is run by a kind gentleman who runs it himself, also providing a driving tour of many notable locations in rural Cork. It begins at Collins' childhood home, now a National Monument and Heritage Site, and concludes with the monument constructed at the location of his death. The monument stands, a Celtic cross emblazoned with the likeness of Christ himself, amongst the rolling hills as a reminder to the nation of those who fought for her. Collins may have lost his life, but he left behind his spirit, his memory, and above all, he left behind freedom. That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.